Finally, Mark reuniting with his wife, or who he thinks is his wife, Bert and Irving meeting in the outside world, Mark acting strange, and a few other details you might not have noticed. Let's dive in and break down episode 5 of Severance season 2. Guys, I think this episode was the one that hid the most details on screen. Obviously, I'm not going to cover all of them here because I'm only bringing up the things I noticed and have some theory about or can see a potential path for. Let's kick off this breakdown by talking about Helly. Helly attends a meeting with Natalie and another guy to discuss the aftermath of the outdoor event that Milchick organized. Helly wanted to report what happened directly to her father, but from what we can gather, they plan to cover up the incident. The mess that happened at the outdoor event won't reach her father. He won't find out about it. But there are two interesting details in this dialogue. The first is that they mention many of Milchick's mistakes over the weekend, which forced them to take action. It makes me wonder, what exactly were those mistakes that made members of Lumon's higher-ups step in? When he said that, I even thought, oh my god, they fired Milchick. But later we see that's not the case. Could he have just been referring to Irving's termination? That seems like too small of an action to warrant that kind of statement, at least in my opinion. We'll have to wait and see. The other detail is that after he says these things, Helly asks, "Did my father approve this?" And the big guy responds, "The father encouraged it." He didn't say "your father," he simply said "the father encouraged it." Could this guy be an Egan as well? Or better yet, could he be Helly's brother? Looking at his physical features and traits, you could argue they're from the same family. I also want to draw your attention to the moment when they're discussing Helly going back as her innie self to the data refinement department. After all, Mark is crucial, and without Helly, he won't do anything. Helly says she won't go back because she's nearly died twice. Once because of Irving, and the other time by her own hand. She even insults the innies, calling them animals. What's interesting about this is that in the video she made for her innie back in season 1, she said to her that she's not even a person. But if we think back to the last episode, she had a very intimate moment with Mark. And honestly, I don't buy that she did that just to sleep with him and move on. She felt something different for Mark there. It even gave me the impression that she wanted to tell him everything. After calling them animals, she says she would go back but would pretend to be Helly again. And of course, they refused because of the risk. Look, it's one of two things. Either Helena is a massive piece of work who only wanted to use Mark and toy with him, or she put on this whole act just to get back in pretending to be Helly so she could be with Mark again. Guys, there's no way she watched Helly with Mark in the video and isn't fazed by it. After all that happened with Mark in the previous episode, she can't just not care now. She wanted to go back. Another thing that got me thinking is when the data refinement team is talking to Milchick. Obviously they want answers, and Milchick mentions that Helena Egan was conducting research. Helly then says, "Stealing my own body?" It's funny she says that because it's the same body but with two different minds, so to speak. As I mentioned in my analysis of the last episode, we often think the external is the true persona, so to speak, but what would stop the innie from being the real one and the external being the temporary one? It's like two minds fighting for ownership of the same body. Who has more claim over it? That's the big dilemma of Severance, and it's one Lumon couldn't care less about addressing. Alright, let's talk about the next character, Milchick. The scenes with Milchick in this episode were really interesting. I want to take a moment to go back to Milchick's meeting with the refinement team and highlight the story he told about the King of Sweden. He said the King of Sweden used to disguise himself to mingle with the crowd so he could hear the people's real complaints. It's so intriguing that he brought up this story because honestly, I see a lot of Milchick himself in this King of Sweden. If you pay close attention, Milchick tries to blend in with the severed employees. He tries to be friendly and approachable, almost like a buddy, to have deeper conversations, and as he said about the king, to hear the real complaints. Sometimes I even get the impression that Milchick actually cares a little more about the innies than some of the other higher-ups at Lumon. Take Koble, for example, she couldn't care less. And finally, we got a glimpse into Milchick's relationship with Ms. Huang, which from the looks of it seems to be pretty complicated and difficult. But the most intriguing moment is when Ms. Huang asks if she can ask a question, but instead she gives an opinion. Milchick immediately shuts her down in a harsh tone, correcting her. She says that he shouldn't allow them to hold a funeral because it would make the employees think they're real people. Okay, first off, let's address this. She says she wants to ask a question, but then offers her opinion instead. This kind of reinforces the idea that Ms. Huang isn't exactly a normal person. She might even be like those strange clones of Mark and the others from the previous episode. However, Ms. Huang seems to be a bit more evolved. Still, she's incredibly odd. And here's another thing. When Milchick held Ms. Huang's current position, we saw him existing outside of Lumon. There were scenes of him living his life outside the building. But Ms. Huang? Not once have we seen her outside the severed floor, except in the last episode where those weird clones were also present. Then there's the moment when Ms. Huang asks if her first performance evaluation is happening that day. This is such a cool moment because it ties directly to the scenes later on, which we'll get into shortly. Now let's talk about Milchick's evaluation. In this scene, Natalie and Milchick meet, and honestly, every time I see these two together, my alert mode kicks in. There's something between them that hasn't been revealed yet. I'm sure of it. Think about it. Natalie always has that big, dazzling smile plastered on her face. But the conversations with Milchick are the only ones where she seems visibly uncomfortable. Take this moment as an example. Milchick asks her how she felt about receiving the paintings, and she completely changes the subject. Her entire demeanor shifts back to her usual smiling facade, and she just moves on. And here's another detail. When Milchick finishes asking his question, she pauses for a moment, nods her head, and then switches expressions entirely. You know what this reminds me of? It's almost like when she was talking to Koble as the council's spokesperson. She would listen to what they said and then pass the message on to Koble. Okay, maybe I'm going off on a crazy tangent here, but could Natalie be under 24-hour surveillance by the council? Could everything she says or does be dictated by them? It's starting to feel like that might be the case. During the evaluation, it's pretty clear that Milchick is in trouble. A lot of things went wrong under his command. Drummond mentions that there were 3 anonymous complaints filed against him. The first complaint was that he uses too many difficult words. The second was that several of the video clips were incorrectly assigned. And the third was about trying to bring the original team back to work with Mark, which didn't work out. So Dylan, Irving, and Helly were brought back instead. Now, who do you think made these complaints about Milchick? To me, it's obvious that Ms. Huang was the one who threw him under the bus. The first complaint sounds like something childish. Seriously, who else would say that? As for the second and third complaints, Ms. Huang was directly involved. Ever since Milchick took over the severed floor, Ms. Huang has been his assistant, so she's aware of all these messes. And remember when she asked if Milchick's evaluation was happening that day? Come on, she probably asked because she wanted to know if this was the day he'd face the consequences of her complaints. This relationship is bound to go south eventually. Drummond even tells Milchick that he pushed too hard for friendly reforms when it came to Mark integrating with the new team he was assigned at the start of Season 2. This implies that Milchick's approach was wrong and that he should have been more ruthless like Koble would have been. This mindset ties directly to what Ms. Huang said earlier in the episode. They're not even real people. It's becoming clear that Ms. Huang is undermining Milchick behind his back. But one thing's for sure, going forward we're going to see a much more tyrannical Milchick, completely different from the one we're used to. Now let's quickly talk about Irving meeting Bert, because their encounter might give us some additional details about Severance. Bert wants to know why Irving showed up at his house, and we find out that Bert wasn't retired, he was fired. And apparently they said it was because he got romantically involved with another employee. But here's what's really interesting. Bert did have a relationship with Irving. The Lumon system expanded quite a bit here, right? But the truth is they genuinely fell for each other. Bert's innie is gay, but so is his outie, and he's even married. This makes me think Irving's outie is very likely also gay. So even without remembering anything from their innie or outie lives, they still feel the same emotions and make the same choices. This leads me to believe that Irving's outie and Bert's outie might also end up falling for each other outside of Lumon. How cool is that detail? Maybe Severance doesn't have the power to completely block certain connections between innies and outies. This suggests that innies might actually be part of their outies, not two entirely separate people. Perhaps Severance just divides the subconscious or something like that. You know how they say one side of the brain is more logical and the other more emotional? Maybe it's something like that. They're still one person, just with their traits divided. We definitely see this difference between innies and outies, like Bert's innie being more emotional and his outie being more serious. It's interesting to think about. Now let's talk about Mark, because there are some really intriguing things going on with him. At the beginning of the episode, we see him taking some pills, and it seems like he might be taking them regularly. Maybe they're meds provided by Lumon? If so, it's strange that he's still taking them, especially since he's already suspicious of Lumon. But the weirdest part isn't even the pills, it's that drink he has. His fridge is stocked with more of that same drink, plus a couple of beers, because hey, nobody's made of steel, right? But other than that, his fridge is practically empty. This got me thinking, I don't remember ever seeing the innies take lunch breaks. At least, not that I can recall. Maybe that drink is some sort of meal replacement or something to suppress hunger during work hours. Mark's behavior in this episode was bizarre. At first, I even thought he might be switching between his innie and outie, but by the end of the episode, he admits he doesn't remember anything. So the whole time, it was actually innie Mark. However, it's possible that Mark's reintegration is already starting to take effect and he hasn't realized it yet. The outie Mark's personality is completely more serious compared to the innie, but in this episode, he acted more like outie Mark than he usually does. Even Helly and Dylan noticed and thought it was odd. But honestly, Mark S. has every reason to be acting this way. Starting with what I think hit him the hardest, realizing that what he thought was a connection with Helly was actually with Helena. Imagine what must have gone through his mind, thinking Helena might have just used him, or worse, that she was running some sort of test on him, simply collecting data or something like that. This idea even makes sense because Milchick told them Helena was conducting an experiment. Now think about it. Mark was in a super intimate moment. The kind where you're having a deep, meaningful conversation. The kind that only happens when you feel something different. Then suddenly you find out none of it was real. It wasn't even with the person you thought it was. It was someone else entirely. That's enough to mess with anyone's head. And now, as Mark himself says in the middle of the episode while talking to Helly, how do I know you're really you? And the craziest part is Helly responding that there's no way to know. He'll just have to trust her. But he's already trusted once and got burned. Even if he does trust her, there's no way to be sure. Mark is dealing with a huge internal struggle. When it comes to reintegration, there's a moment at Irving's funeral where everyone is sad, but Mark doesn't seem to care. The others question why he's so indifferent, and he responds by saying, he's not dead, he's just not here. A very typical outie Mark thought process. Later, at Outie Mark's house, when the scientist who performed the reintegration is looking through Gemma's belongings, his wife, she finds her cremated remains in a box. She asks him, was it her? And he responds, well, I thought it was, but she's not dead, she's just not here. The phrases are identical between his innie and outie, which clearly shows that reintegration is already taking effect. But something that really caught my attention was when Mark told the scientist that he still couldn't remember anything from inside Lumon after the reintegration. She responds by saying, maybe your innie remembers. That's insane to think about. The innie might have access to the outie's memories, but the reverse might not be true. Imagine if innie Mark is accessing his outie's memories without outie Mark even realizing it. This episode was packed with details, but then again, which episode of Severance isn't? Let me know in the comments what you thought about everything I've shared here, and let's keep the conversation going. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please help us out by subscribing to the channel and helping us reach 1,000 subscribers. We really need it. Thank you so much, and see you next time.